Hello and welcome to episode 38 of The Garden Log with me, Ben Darg. I am a gardener and I am also a voice, the voice of the plants. It's been a busy week for me. I've been doing some basic horticultural tasks and I've been doing some shopping for plants, and I have visited some gardens near me to purloin ideas for my own space. The heat has broken. I spent a couple of days rather soggy, a reminder of what gardening in the English summer is normally like, a welcome reminder. It's nice that the sun is once more something to be looked forward to, something to savour, to stop when it breaks from behind the clouds and take a quiet minute of enjoyment, rather than regarding it as some sort of unrelenting pursuer sent to chase you and hound you and harry you through your entire working day. The plants will certainly be happy, and I am happy, but then I am normally fairly happy anyway. Enough of an introduction, let's get on with the week in gardening. Welcome to the week in gardening. This week started, like so many weeks before it, on a Monday, and it started up a ladder. I was pruning wisteria, and pruning wisteria, I think, is one of those core horticultural skills. It is a job that should be in every professional gardener's repertoire. It's like being a concert violinist. Your repertoire would probably include a Bach sonata, or if you are a plumber, your repertoire might include replacing a perished washer. And if you are a criminal, it would probably be a basic knife point mugging. No complicated frauds here, just a core job. I think if we talk about core jobs, it's up there with rose pruning, with pricking out a tray of seedlings, with servicing your secateurs, with cutting a low box hedge, and perhaps taking cuttings from a pelargonium. Those jobs that you learn in the first year of horticultural college and then somehow get coded into your DNA. This week it was August, and my DNA was calling to me, and it was saying snip, snip, snip. And I obeyed. I snipped back the new summer growth to about 5 buds. And I say about 5 buds, I mean 5 buds. I snipped it back to exactly 5 buds. And by buds, I mean the point where each leaf emerges. Buds is easier when talking about these things to novice gardeners, because wisteria have fairly complex leaves. They have a pinnate compound leaf with lots of little leaflets, normally 9 or so of them. And if you tell someone to prune it back to 5 leaves, then quite often you just get the whole shrub really laboriously chopped, and each leaf has effectively been chopped in half, which is an incredible testament to the will of people to carry on doing things, but is entirely incorrect. So take it to 5 buds on the new growth and you will be fine. This length will depend on the vigour of your wisteria, the position that it's in, the age, and the shoot itself, but normally that would be 1.5 feet of growth, something like that. The first 3 buds will probably be quite close together, and then there might be 6 inches between the next couple of them. And this nifty little job has a number of core functions. The first of them is to keep it from pulling down the gutters and worming its way between the tiles like an unwanted hand on a tube train. It gets everywhere, and it also reduces the weight of the plant. So we're due for a bit more wind, we're heading towards those tempestuous months, and we don't want the whole plant ripped away from the wall. There's nothing more depressing than coming in on a morning after a wet and windy weekend and seeing the wisteria lying slumped on the terrace like the casualty of a saloon bar brawl. Not for me, this horrible fate, as my wisteria is now pruned back. While I was up on the ladder, I did some checking on the ties, making sure that it was still attached securely to the wall. And it was, so I didn't bother with any of the more remedial prunings. I didn't thin or pick out shoots that will one day form a flowering structure. I didn't help shape the career path of this wisteria at all. That will all be done in the formative month of February. So that was Monday. I spent the time forming this giant mound of tendrils at the base of the ladder, and then I took them all off to the compost heap and chopped them up in situ with a pole pruner. This is so that I can dig them in more effectively. And the reason that I am being so considerate towards the compost this week will all come clear when I get on to Tuesday's activities. What are we waiting for? On Tuesday, I turned the compost heap. Not something usually worthy of note. When you listen to other episodes of the garden log, and I don't mention the compost heap turning, you just have to assume, fill in the gaps for yourself, and say in one of those fallow moments that I didn't inform you about, I turned the compost heap. But I normally use a digger. We have a big orange digger, and at the end of each day, I stir up the heat to keep it oxygenated and hot, and make sure that all the different bits of rotting material are introduced to all the other bits of rotting material. Unfortunately, there are great works afoot. There are bits of York stone and cement and trenches being dug by people more able than I. The landscapers are back, and they've taken the digger to sit on and smoke rollies next to. It's much more useful to them than to me, but this means that I need to turn the compost heap by hand, which I haven't done for an awful long time. So I jumped into the heap with a big long pitchfork, which I find quite useful for these things, and started heaving slabs of the stuff up. It's very hot. It's like walking on a semi-crusted volcano, I think. It doesn't smell at all, but it radiates this warm breath up your ankles. Our compost heap is like an iceberg, and a lot of it is actually below ground. You can only see the tip. It recedes down into this wonderful silo built from breeze blocks that goes down about 6 foot into the earth. And it was quite useful getting in there with the pitchfork because it meant that I could really go into the corners of the compost heap manually where the digger teeth can't reach. And I hauled out big fat slabs of leaves. About 3 weeks ago, we emptied the last of the fallen leaves from November 2017 into the heap, and I had assumed they'd all been broken down. My digger work had mixed them and mumbled them up with all the grass clippings and dead-headed dahlias, but no, they still lurked in those corners. Fat, flat pancakes of them, away from the main heat of the heap. So it was very pleasing to find those bits and to push them out there. And then, after that was done, I dismantled my hanging basket monstrosities. I did this because the sweet peas are coming towards the end of their life. They're still flowering, and particularly some of the very vigorous single-coloured ones, Winston Churchill in red and Leamington White, surprisingly in white, have been going so well all summer. But the other ones, the two-tone ones, the turquoise skies, and the others, not that I can't remember offhand which ones they were, but they've turned into little dry clumps of semi-mildewed plant fuss. There's still enough flowers to justify them, but I think that sometimes you treat plants like relationships, and you don't have to stick it out until the bitter end when it all gets very hateful. Sometimes you go while you still have a bit of fondness and affection for each other. And I'm still fond of sweet peas at this time of year. They were still doing enough, but I could see the decline. It was time to rip them out. And once they had gone, there was no need for their supports, and the supports were what hung the baskets full of trailing petunias and trailing pelargoniums and fuchsias and all sorts of other lobelia-ish stuff. And to be honest, I was glad to see all of that go. It's been very fun to do, and I think it's helped me as a gardener because I haven't grown things like that before. I haven't really had to tend to the incredibly needy children that hanging baskets are. I mean, honestly, you ignore them for one weekend and they have started dying. It's awful. And they at the end, they weren't looking as good as they might. They had grown into the plants around them. So they'd grown into the dahlias growing up from the ground, and they had grown into the other things that are down there, the Madeirense geraniums and the cosmos. But rather than forming a harmonious symphony of flowers, they formed a block, a big rectangle from the floor to about 8 foot in height that was very hard to get one's head around. When you saw it, it was just leaf and flower. It looked like almost overdone wallpaper. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I was growing tired of seeing them. But having got them down, I was able to sort out the dahlias a bit better and to let them spread themselves out a bit more, to nod, to send their flower stalks in a few more directions. They required some extra staking, but they look a lot more natural now because you can see the different height of different plants at what is a miniature dahlia and what is a maximal dahlia. They aren't just one more component in the battlefront of vegetation. The hanging baskets really should have gone straight into the compost, but I couldn't bear to throw away all these bedding plants when they were still alive, and so I laboriously dug them out of their basket, teased the roots out. Hanging baskets are great, by the way, when you empty them and the plants have taken every single bit of root space they can. So you turn them up and you get this dome covered in these marbling squiggly veins, and it looks like the brain of some giant vegetable king that is left exposed on the ground. So I hacked up this vegetable brain and each plant got a bit of root, and I planted them out in a fairly heavily bedded out area of the garden, where the petunias, particularly the red petunias, can scramble away, and the fuchsias can do their little old-fashioned fuchsia thing. 3 of the baskets I did not split up, the ones with the vast quantities of that trailing nepeta, the nepeta that had got up to probably 8 foot in sections. I hung from a row of fairly gnarled thuya trees, and I took out most of the very bright flowers at the top and just left these trailing tendrils down, because to me it looks like one of those growths of older trees completely hung with tillandsia, hung with that Spanish moss, that very creepy southern Gothic style plant. And I love that look. When we were in Bogota, there were a couple of trees round the corner for us. I think they were in the gardens of 2 embassies that faced off across the road, the Brazilian embassy and the Swedish embassy, and they both had these amazingly tall trees covered in this trailing Spanish moss. And I loved it dearly, and so I have sentimentally recreated it on the edge of the Chilterns. I like to think that my employer will get the most out of me if I am enjoying myself, and these are the kind of things that let me enjoy my job even more. And that little store of enjoyment took me through Tuesday afternoon and indeed through Wednesday. It was a fairly laborious job. On Thursday, I thought that I better keep those levels of excitement high, and I brought out a mower that I haven't used yet this season. I don't know why, probably because it's slightly awkwardly positioned in the mower store and is inconvenient to get at. But I bought out one of the Allet mowers, a cylinder mower, and this cylinder mower has an auto steer seat on the back of it, which means essentially the mower is transformed into a ride-on. You sit behind it, it drags you along, and you have a separate roller underneath your seat, so the grass is getting rolled twice for the one price. This is quite useful for creating a very, very heavy stripe. These are quite big steel cylinder mowers, the Allet Buckingham models, and they are heavy enough to create a great stripe anyway, but with my extra weight added to them, then they really put that green and shiny look onto the grass. and I sound like a high-end mower salesman now, though no shame in that. The exciting thing about driving with the auto steer seat is that it feels like you're in one of those little sulkies, those strange gigs pulled behind horses where they just have the two wheels and a seat, that or a very small chariot. So I went up and down an area of fine lawn, putting these wonderful stripes in, and while I did so, I listened to a programme on Radio 4 about the science and the history of stripes, which was one of those rare moments of serendipity, like listening to the Archers while milking a cow, or Moneybox Live while checking your bank account. We have to take refuge in these small pleasures, and I had to take refuge of a more literal sort later on because it started to rain. And I stayed out in the rain for a while doing sundry horticultural work, and then I actually got very cold. And so the rest of the afternoon was spent slightly miserable. There is an old adage that it is far easier to stay warm than it is to heat up, and we all must remember this as we slide back towards the colder months. Getting wet and cold is the death of joy and productivity in the garden. It leads to sulking and an overdependence on tea. And an overdependence on tea brings other problems, such as brown teeth and caffeine jitters, all of which I had by the end of Thursday. Friday was, if anything, wetter. It was torrential at points. We started the day weeding and took to the canopies under the trees, which is fine at first because they do a passable impression of an umbrella for the first 20 minutes or so of rain, but then the rain really knuckled down to it and decided to start taking things seriously. And slowly the tree lost its waterproof qualities. It just channeled the droplets into bigger drops and eventually rivulets that it sent cascading down my neck. Once the visibility was down to about 3 foot and the entire air was white and thick with water, as if we lived in one big cube of wetness from sky to ground, I decided to call it a day and head inside to order some plants. Like the Wisteria job that we started the week with, there is another seasonal job that I like to get done in August, which is my bulb order. These are the bulbs that I will be planting until my hands bleed over the autumn and early winter. Now, I won't go through the entirety of the order now because I'm just stealing material from my future self. I'll explain my ideas for each of the planting areas and what I hope to accomplish with the various bulbs when I actually put them in. But as something of a teaser, I've ordered so far something like 500 daffodils, a similar amount of tulips, lots and lots of cyclamen coum, hundreds of anemone nemorosa, snowdrops, the basic bog-standard Galanthus nivalis, some very, very big lilies, some Camassia, that's an experiment that I'm going to try, that's Camassia cusickii. I don't know if anyone's tried naturalising that in deer-prone areas. We'll see if they find it tasty or not. Some imperial fritillaries in the orange form for that wow factor, and a couple of hundred China doxa. I'm sure that I will put in another bulb order over the next few weeks, but that's enough to get things going. The main disappointment from that was I wanted to get a lot of Tulipa sprengeri, that wonderful red species tulip that all of the people in the know praise in the gardening world, but it seems the people in the know have bought all the stocks of it. The plants themselves, they're costing about £5 for an individual bulb, which is not quite tulipomania levels, but was rather more than I was willing to pay, considering as I want them for a mass planting. So I contented myself with buying a load of Tulipa sprengeri seeds, and hopefully in a few years' time the effect will be ready. I've never grown tulips from seed, because why would you, unless you are faced with just this situation? So that was that. Friday done, and work stockpiled for the future. like a diligent ant gathering seeds for winter, I am storing bulbs for working days yet to come. If you haven't done your bulb order, I suggest getting onto it now. If you don't want to do a bulb order, then just wait until they start appearing in the shops and garden centres, and that will make your life a lot easier. That was the end of that working week. I went home to try and dry myself off, and to drink a nice glass of red wine and record this podcast. So, let's see if I manage to record any recommendations this week. My recommendation this week is The London Gardener, a sourcebook and guide by the much-missed Elizabeth Thompson. It's, as it says on the cover, a source of advice for people gardening in London and a guide to where to go to see interesting things, to pick forbidden fruits, to buy curious objects. I turned to it this week because I was looking for inspiration for my front garden. Like many people, I have a problematic front garden. It's shared with a few other flats within this broken-up Victorian house. It has one hedge of privet, one hedge of lavender, and one hedge that isn't actually a hedge, but is in fact two largish lime trees cut off at thigh level and allowed to sprout wild and crazy like a Greek moustache. There is no soil. There is a very thick concrete pad with gravel scattered over the top of it, and there are curious objects like a solidly built brick house for the gas meters. This is combined with all of the space needed to house the impressive collection of wheelie bins in 3 separate shades. It's very hard space to know what to do with. I'm veering towards pots. Anyway, I turned to Elspeth for guidance. Not in her advice, which is sound and solid. She advises lots of different front garden things. She likes minimalism. And she also likes grey slate as a ground cover. I don't think I will go for the slate, but what I was really turning to the book for were her recommendations of where to go to see inspirational front gardens in London. I find that you can draw inspiration from most streets, but there are some areas that are particularly special. She recommends Addison Avenue, Chalcot Square, Chomut Square, Gordon Place, Hamilton Terrace, somewhere in Little Venice, Malvern Terrace, Mansfield Place, somewhere in Portobello, Vincent Square and Willow Road. Luckily one of these, Chomut Square, is just down the road from me, so I hopped on my bicycle and went to see what they'd done there. And it's a fantastic little place. It's 2 little rows of cottages with no road in between them, just a gate and a pathway. Though the pathway is no longer a straight thing of paving slabs. It is a serpentine slalom between rows of pots, between and under arches of roses and solamnum. There are strange things growing everywhere, and every single house has joined in this collective will to green. I guess it's the power of social shame. If you're the only one who has nothing in their front garden, then you would be ostracised in this community. The pot displays are quite fantastic. Some of them put Great Dixter, if not to shame, then to a good bit of honest competition. And the neighbours have worked together with trellising going from one person's front garden right over the street into another's. It's described in Elspeth's book as a floral canyon, and I really got that impression when I was there. We'd just come out of the end of this period of drought and thinking about the London of the future. And it reminded me of when I was in Crete earlier in the year, all of the canyons we went walking in, and the rest of the island is bleached and parched and dry rock, and then down in the bottom of these canyons are these ribbons of green, full of oleander and plane trees and voodoo lily. And this street could be the future of London. In the shade, we could all retreat and cultivate these patches in between our houses, and we could string vines between front bathrooms and have shade netting between windows like people used to have washing lines or bunting. It's a great future. Anyway, I spent some time casing that joint until the homeowners really were thinking that I was going to burgle them. And then I went home and jotted down a few ideas. And I'll talk about that when I come to purchase the pots and start planting things out. But if you live in London, you should really try and get hold of a copy of The London Gardener. And even if you don't, it's full of very sound advice. And it's also the words and the work of someone who cared about what she was writing about. So it's always going to be a pleasure to read. I don't know how she got the time to visit all of the places recommended in this book. I think I could live here for 15 years and not get round to all of them. So that is my recommendation for this week. My other recommendation is that now is the time to start making a note of what has worked and what has failed in the garden. Because when you come to plan your projects for next year, in the giddy rush of spring, you won't remember quite as well what particular parts were a failure and which plants let you down. But if you just go around now and say, well, maybe it's time to try something different there, maybe it's time to whip this out, then you will be in a better place to make those ruthless, horrible, heartless decisions that good gardening calls for. I thank you very much for listening to episode 38 of The Garden Log. I have greatly enjoyed recording this episode. I'm now thoroughly dry and my glass is empty, so I'm going to go and get a top up and say goodbye until next week. Cheerio.